My guy Abe Lincoln once said, "Folks are usually about as happy as they make up their minds to be." I buy it, and I'm bought in. Those of you who are new to my channel may not know that I pay the bills with a real estate photography business that I started in 2016. This business grew from much consideration of the wise words of the estimable Mr. Lincoln. I had a stable gig in financial services, but it occurred to me that I could make up my mind to be happier. And for me, that meant being my own boss. So I did it. And today, I'm going to hit you with some steps to build a real estate biz of your own if you're so inclined. Of course, you should vet all these steps. I'm not an attorney or a government official. I'm just some photog talking about personal experience and lessons learned. And while we're at it, a few more words of context here. Though I'm presenting these steps in what I consider a sensible order, that order isn't set in stone. Indeed, it's possible to overlap or use a different order entirely. Also, I'm just going to assume you have an interest in real estate photography as a gig, whether that's as a side hustle or as a way to make a living. I'm not going to spend a bunch of time trying to convince you that it's an awesome, financially viable career path. Okay, so let's get after it. Step 1. Secure or allocate the money to do this thing right. How much, you ask? Well, here's a list of the most relevant expenses for me when I started. Number 1. About $400 to hire an attorney to draft my LLC paperwork. Number 2. About $100 for city, county, and state licensure. Number 3, $600 or so for photography gear. Number 4, also about $600 for a capable computer. Mine was a used Mac. Number 5, about $200 to cover editing software and cloud storage for the year. In summary, I spent just under $2,000 over the first 12 months. Hey, maybe you already have a great camera and lens combo, or a new computer with good editing software. Maybe you have a buddy who's an attorney. Perhaps you could save a bunch of bread during the startup phase, and if so, that's awesome. If not, it's still possible with a bit of scrimping and saving. So let's continue with Step 2. Sort out the requirements to operate legally. Early on in the game, I secured a federal employee ID number, FEIN, check out the link below, and had an attorney drop my LLC paperwork. Then I registered with my state Department of Revenue, and after that, got my county and city licenses. Incidentally, I needed the paperwork that the attorney drafted for my LLC to do that state registration, which brings me to something of a disclaimer. You may have a different order of operations in your neck of the woods. What worked in Missouri may not cut the mustard in Vermont, for example. So do a little research. Step 3. Secure some sensible gear. It bears mentioning that my business is all stills, in other words, no video, and all natural light photography. You can go down a rabbit hole of gear if you want to shoot video and use flash, but I'm stripping it down to the essentials here, both for cost and for the sake of efficiency. So from my perspective, sensible gear is a full-frame or APS-C camera that can shoot exposure bracketed images and an ultra-wide-angle lens. Let's quickly look at each of those, then talk about the ancillary bits. The camera. I'm agnostic when it comes to full-frame versus APS-C for real estate. This is because a proper exposure bracket will capture enough highlight and shadow detail to create a quality image once it's merged into an HDR, which I'll talk about in just a minute. I've had good results with Sony, Canon, and Fuji cameras, and these days I shoot with a Leica M240. There are some pros that would recommend that you get a camera with dual card slots, and I understand the thinking there. Backups are nice. But it's also possible to use a one card slot camera and then make a backup on site right after you shoot. That's part of my routine with the Leica. Shoot the gig, back up the card. Shoot the next gig, back up the card, etc. And let's be honest here, while it would absolutely be a hassle to have to reshoot a house due to a memory card failure, it's not the same risk as missing the decisive moment at a wedding. Generally, a house isn't going anywhere. The lens. Get something ultra-wide here, ideally 14 to 16 millimeters full-frame equivalent. Any wider and it looks a little off, and any tighter and the space begins to look claustrophobic. I've had a bunch of lenses, but for the last 2 years I've been shooting almost exclusively with a Voigtlander 15mm manual focus prime. If you do it right, it's a set it and forget it type of operation. You absolutely can use an autofocus lens, and I did for many years, but the insides of houses are often relatively dark, and in dark rooms where there's no furniture, you run the risk of autofocus hunting or just missing entirely. The rest. You'll need a sturdy tripod with a ball head. I found a Manfrotto at an antique store for $25. Sure, it's a little older and a little heavier than the new carbon fiber stuff, but I'll take the trade-off, as the stability on the Manfrotto is amazing. And when you shoot bracketed images, you'll want that camera to stay still. You should have a couple memory cards, and like I said before, if you use a camera with one card slot, you may want to bring a notebook computer or some other kind of backup device. Step 4. Practice shooting and editing. This part can be a lot of fun, and the strategy that I suggest is to, number 1, look at a bunch of images on, say, Realtor.com to get a sense of what looks good and what doesn't. Number 2, use your house or the home of a friend or family member to practice your compositions and technique. Like I mentioned before, I'm into the exposure bracketing, so I recommend taking 3-shot brackets to include one properly exposed image, one 2 steps darker, and one 2 steps brighter. For what it's worth, I'll include a link to a full image set, showing exactly what I would deliver to a client. In a nutshell, I typically shoot 10 or 15 exteriors, 3 or 4 images of each of the major rooms, kitchen, dining room, living room, primary bedroom, and 2 or 3 of the other spaces, laundry rooms, half baths, unfinished bedrooms, etc. I don't typically shoot the insides of closets, utility spaces, sheds, unless the client specifically requests it. Once you're in the groove, a typical shoot will take between a half an hour and an hour. Especially large homes may take as much as an hour and a half. So practice with what you've got until you have a good handle on the process and enough images to practice the art of editing. I have a subscription to Adobe Lightroom and Photoshop. I've tried others, including Capture One and Affinity Photo, and as much as I like these others, I found the Adobe products to be best for my workflow. And that workflow is, number 1, import the bracketed images into Lightroom. Number 2, using Lightroom, merge those images into HDR photos. Number 3, straighten, crop, color correct, and exposure correct. And number 4, export JPEGs at the client specs, or at my default, which is 12 inches on the long side by 144 dots per inch. Once I have the image set completed, I upload it to my Google Drive and send the client a link to the appropriate folder. I deliver about 24 hours after the conclusion of the shoot. A quick word here. There are editors out there who will do this part for you, and most do really good work. So it's absolutely an option to farm out the editing if you're so inclined. I do on occasion, not very often, but every once and again. Step 5. Get some clients and price your work. Your clients will be real estate agents and brokers. Just introduce yourself to them in person and show them a few sample images. There are offices all over the place. Even if they don't have time for a cold walk-in, they can at least put a face and a name to the follow-up call or email you're going to send them later. Early on, I found great success offering one free shoot to a broker and a one-time 50% discount to their agents. 90% of the folks that took me up on the free shoot or discount used me more than once, some of them scores of times. Remember, your first goal is just to be better than a very busy agent rushing through a space and shooting images with an iPhone. For goodness sake, just make their jobs a little easier. If you've given any attention to step 4, you should be able to do that, and if you're easy to work with, it's a no-brainer for a busy agent. Hey, I get that in the modern era, you're going to want to throw up some images on Facebook or Insta and have the agents come to you. In my experience, they won't. Speaking candidly, I've tried a bunch of social media approaches. None of them came close to being as effective as face-to-face contact. Sure, some are going to pass, but the ones that get it will use you, potentially use you regularly, and recommend you to their colleagues. Let's talk about pricing. Some photogs base prices on square footage, some on the number of bedrooms, and some bid jobs individually. I like to keep it simple. My pricing is based on the anticipated listing price of a house. I found that this metric tracks very closely with the amount of time and effort I'll spend on a given shoot. To that end, I've included a price list below that spells it out. The abridged version is this. I charge between $100 and $250 depending on the property. Now let's look at the last step. Step 6, record keeping. I use Google Drive and pay $2.99 a month for 200 gigabytes of storage. And what do I store there? Number 1, the edited images. Each shoot gets its own folder, which the agent has access to for at least a few weeks, sometimes longer. Number 2, my gross receipts spreadsheet. I track date, client, location, mileage, home listing price, the price I charged, invoice number, and whether or not it was paid. This makes it super easy at tax time. Number 3, expenses. Yep, it's another spreadsheet. I capture it all in a Google Sheet, and stick my paper receipts in an envelope. Number 4, invoices. I make my invoices using Google Docs and then download each invoice as a PDF so that I can save it locally and also bill my client. Hey, remember when I mentioned taxes? A word of advice here, use an accountant. I met with mine before I even started the business so that I could get a sense of how they worked and what they would need from me at tax time. As an added bonus, my guy actually connected me with the attorney that drafted my LLC paperwork. Okay, that's it for now. If there's an appetite for more, I would definitely consider in-depth videos on any or each of the steps. Let me know in the comments below if you think that would be of use and what you might like to learn more about. Thanks, and happy shooting.